everybody take their seats, please? We're going to begin promptly at 11. Valerie has a lot to say. Welcome to the College of Humanities annual P.A. Christensen Lecture. This is an annual event we look forward to at the College of Humanities, the P.A. Christensen Lectureship. The P.A. Christensen Lectureship is a series that's been sponsored annually by the College of Humanities to honor Dr. Valerie Christensen, who was a faculty member in the English department from 1927 to 1965. And he was known widely not only as a teacher and scholar, but also as a lecturer and writer, served as chairman of the English department, and passed away in 1968. We're grateful to honor his legacy today, and I would like to invite all previous recipients of the Christensen Lecture to please stand and be recognized. Today we're honored to recognize Valerie Hegstrom, Professor of Spanish, as the latest P.A. Christensen Lecturer. I would like, before honoring her with a plaque, however, I'd like to honor those who make her contributions possible, her family. So if you would stand as I read your names: her husband, Professor Dale Pratt, their children, Thomas, JJ, Sam, Bill, and Joseph, grandchildren Etienne and Damien, and a great niece, Jamie. That's all we have. Now, Valerie, if you could come forward, I'll award you the plaque that makes you an official Christensen Lecturer. You're now officially qualified to lecture. The program will proceed with an invocation by Brandy Siegfried, Associate Professor of English, and then a brief introduction by colleague Heather Belknap, Associate Professor of Art History, and then we'll hear from Professor Hegstrom.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are so grateful that we had the chance today to come together and celebrate the accomplishments of Professor Valerie Hegstrom. We are so very grateful that Valerie has blessed this university with her work, her scholarship, her teaching, her service. But we're also very grateful that she's just such a good person. We ask you to bless her today, that she will be calm and focused, and that she will take pleasure in speaking to us. We ask you to bless us, that we will be attentive to her words. And we pray these things with gladness. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen.
There are many things you may know about this year's P.A. Christensen Lecturer: that she has the sunniest of dispositions and boundless energy, that she holds an infectious passion for Golden Age theater, literary women, and all things Spain and Portugal, or that she and husband colleague Dale Pratt have built an amazing life career together, studying, teaching, and shepherding dozens of people through their intellectual and physical journeys of these countries, and raising 5 really terrific human beings. If you spent any time with Valerie Hegstrom, you certainly know that women and women's contributions are central to her life's mission. And you know her as the heart, soul, mind, and especially might behind the university's Global Women's Studies, which, under her masterful direction over the last 8 or so years, has become something quite extraordinary. Let me share with you a few things you may not know about my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Valerie Hegstrom. After completing a BA in English with a Spanish minor and an MA in comparative literature from BYU, she took an MA and PhD in Spanish literature with a minor in theater from the University of Kansas, where she wrote a dissertation on the comedias of the Spanish Golden Age theater. She then accepted a position at the University of New Mexico for a few years before being hired away back to BYU. Valerie's scholarship focuses on the recovery of literary texts authored by early modern women in Spain and Portugal. and involves translation, editing, criticism, and performance. Her publications include numerous journal articles and chapters on the Spanish theater and women's writings, as well as a collection of essays, Engendering the Early Modern Stage, Women Playwrights in the Spanish Empire, which she co-edited. In order to amplify awareness and admiration for early modern theater beyond Shakespeare, she and Dale launched a multi-year Spanish Golden Age theater production initiative in the aughts, supported by BYU Mentor Learning Grants. And these works were staged locally and on campuses throughout the Western United States and Mexico. Her translations of two woman-authored plays, Maria de Thais, La Traición en la Amistad, apologies to all those who speak any sort of Spanish, and Ángela de Azevedo's El Muerto Disimulado, have been performed in Virginia, Oklahoma, and Washington, D.C. Significantly, Professor Hegstrom received a scholarly editions and translations grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to complete her work on El Muerto Disimulado. And last year, her achievements in the field were recognized by the Association for Hispanic Classical Theater, which awarded her the David Gitlitz Comedia Prize in Pedagogy and Mentorship. A popular lecturer, she has been invited to speak and deliver keynote addresses in distinguished international and national venues, including the University of Porto and University of Lisbon, U.S. universities from coast to coast, and institutions closer to home. In addition to speaking on Golden Age theater and early modern writers, Valerie is also frequently called upon to discuss various aspects of women's lives, historical and contemporary, and their struggles and triumphs. Professor Hegstrom is a masterful teacher and a generous mentor and has blessed the lives of countless students and colleagues. Indeed, she cares deeply about her work and about people. And when you hear Valerie lecture or read her writing or talk to her in the halls or participate in one of her events or have the privilege of having long, nourishing talks over dinner or walking the streets of Madrid or Lisbon and being tutored by her deep knowledge and abiding love for these places, you come to know this and to feel grateful for it. Dr. Hegstrom is particularly partial to her nuns, as she calls them, women who were critical participants in early modern peninsular literary culture. One of my favorite talk titles of hers is How My Nuns Have Made Me a Better Mormon. You should ask her about this. In addition to her extensive presentation and public record on these holy women writers, she also marks their importance by taking you on pilgrimages to their convents and by throwing parties in their honor. Yes, Valerie hosted a celebration of St. Teresa of Avila's 500th birthday in 2015, and it was fabulous. She's recently completed a translation of the Portuguese Abbess Maria Seu's allegory on Canis Due Bosque de Sanganis Due Liu, Portuguese is hard, which is the subject of her address today. Please join me in welcoming this year's honored recipient of the P.A. Christensen Lectureship.
The first P.A. Christensen lecture was given the same year I became a new student at BYU. Over the years, I was privileged to take classes from 11 recipients of the award, and many others served as valued mentors, colleagues, and friends. It is an honor to be the fourth woman in 42 years and the first woman outside the English department to deliver the Christensen lecture. I am grateful to the Christensen family, the selection committee, and the college office for making this possible. I'm also grateful for Brandy and Heather for their kindness, generosity, and friendship. Many thanks to the members of the Translation Studies group and the Women's Studies Teaching and Research group, as well as my writing group friends Jennifer, Rex, and Annalisa, all of whom have encouraged me and offered generous feedback on my research about Maria Lucero. I'm particularly indebted to my friend Christina Calloway, who throughout our collaborations has shared my enthusiasm for Maria Lucero's writing. I am richly blessed with a loving and supportive family, one of my brothers, 5 of my children, 2 grandsons, a great niece, and many friends have come to support me today. I love my husband, Dale Pratt. He is my cheerleader, and like the women writers whom I study, Dale is much more than a muse. Thank you all for being here. The first 10 chapters of Maria Duceo's allegory, Enganos do Bosque, Desenganos do Rio, The Grove's Enchantments, The River's Disenchantments, appeared in an anthology of her works with the same title in 1736. The author was 77 or 78 years old. This was her 6th published book, and she no longer used her pseudonym, Madre Marina Clemencia, which had appeared on her first 3 books. She must have felt her pen name unnecessary because, on the one hand, her works seem to have received universal praise, and on the other, as early as 1731 and 1733, Antonio dos Reis and Manuel Bautista de Castro had revealed that Marina Clemencia was of the Franciscan convent of St. Michael's Island, was none other than Maria Duceo of the convent of Our Lady of Hope in Lisbon. The introductory materials in her earlier books and the Livro da Fundação, the chronicle of her convent, tell the tale of her reluctance to publish her works. Apparently, in their enthusiasm, some of her sister nuns stole manuscript copies of her works to pass through the iron grill in the parlor of the convent to visitors who would carry them to censors and publishing houses in the city and pay to have Sor Maria's works, poems, stories, allegories, and plays printed. By the time the 1736 version of Enganos do Bosque appeared, though, Maria Duceo surely knew of her publication's success and had become involved in the process. Enganos do Bosque tells the story of a peregrina, or pilgrimess, who arrives at a crossroads and must choose which path to take, the pleasant one which leads to the flowery, lush grove of the hunter, or the harsh road strewn with rocks and brambles which leads eventually to the garden of the shepherd. Although John Bunyan had published a similar allegory about a male and Protestant pilgrim 58 years earlier in 1678, Sor Maria likely had no access to Pilgrim's Progress, which first came out in Spanish in 1776 and in Portuguese in 1782, nearly 30 years after the nun's death. She may instead have read Alexandre de Guzmão's 1682 allegory, Historia do Predestinado Peregrino, the story of the predestined pilgrim, recently translated by our own colleague Kit Lund. In any case, Sor Maria's allegory differs from those of the 2 male clerics in at least one notable way. Her protagonist, the peregrina, who represents the soul, is female. Her gender mattered to the readers in Lisbon's convent of Our Lady of Hope because the nuns had taken vows that led them to identify in a particular way with the pilgrimess in her journey to unite with the shepherd in his garden. The allegory asserts that female pilgrims have agency, can choose between vice and virtue, and can find their way to God without the mediation of male ecclesiastical authority. In the 1736 part 1 of the allegory, however, the peregrina has not yet found her way to the shepherd's garden. Lured by the nymphs, she wanders into the grove to drink from its spring, has her heart violently pulled from her breast by the hunter's spear, worships 6 false gods, grows disillusioned by their counterfeit appearances, and through prayer finds her way out of the grove in the midst of a storm conjured by the hunter, who is also a great magician. The pilgrimess finds herself abruptly back at the crossroads, and just as abruptly the narrative voice declares, "If there is someone to recount this journey in the second part of this story, she will discover the garden in paradise." So ends part 1 of the allegory. Then a note appears. The author did not have time to compose the second part. We cannot know if the 77-year-old writer drafted the 10 chapters of part 1 of Enganos do Bosque in the months before its publication, or if she pulled the manuscript from an old trunk in her cell, dusted it off, and handed it over to Father Francisco da Costa, who was anxious to publish more of her work. We do know, however, that 5 years later, in 1741, the 82 or 83-year-old nun handed another set of manuscripts over to Padre Francisco to publish, including part 2, the final 4 chapters of Enganos do Bosque. During that 5-year period, Soror Maria was actively writing, composing prose and poetry in 2 languages. In the years that followed, dozens of editions and translations of portions of Enganos do Bosque would domesticate, dislocate, mistranslate, misread, and regender the text and erase the identity of its author. In 1744, just 3 years after Part 2 of Enganos do Bosque appeared in Lisbon, Fernando de Septién Calderón de la Barca published the 2-volume Obras Varias y Admirables, varied and admirable works de la Madre María do Céu in Madrid. Fernando de Septién Calderón de la Barca was one of the pen names adopted by Father Enrique Flores, Spanish Enlightenment historian, translator, coin collector, Augustinian friar, and chaired professor at the Universidad Complutense in Alcalá de Henares. Although Soror Maria's 5th book similarly carried the title Obras Varias y Admirables, Padre Flores excerpted works from several of her books to make up the contents of his anthology. For the opening selection, he chose Enganos do Bosque. He dedicated the book to Maria Teresa de Moncada y Benavides, the Spanish Duchess of Medinaceli, admirer of and frequent correspondent with Maria do Céu. The friar saw himself not simply as an editor or translator of the nun's texts. The title page of the book claims that her various and admirable works are corrected of the many defects in the Portuguese edition and explained with brief notes by Dr. Fernando de Septién Calderón de la Barca. In his introduction to the reader, Padre Flores describes his experience of discovering Maria do Céu's books and his initial doubts about her writing. He explains poetically, "It seems to me in the beginning that it was a lot of flowers for a nun and too many pearls for someone dressed in sackcloth. But then I saw that the flowers turned into fruits." Later, he mixes benevolent sexism with faint praise. The Portuguese printing is as full of defects as in copies that were stolen and that must have been passed around in the hands of women who do not usually know how to cut quills. I would have been happy to enjoy originals or a corrected edition, for they would have saved me a great deal of work in finding the meaning even of the works in prose. Padre Flores traveled widely throughout the Iberian Peninsula, carrying out research for the 29 volumes of España Sagrada, Sacred Spain, his history of the Christian Church in Spain. But in spite of all his wishing for originals or corrected editions, he failed to take a side trip to Lisbon or even to mention in his introduction that in 1744, Maria do Céu was still very much alive and would be for another 9 years until she reached nearly 95 years of age. After suggesting that the women involved in the circulation of Soror Maria's manuscripts not only introduced errors as they copied, but probably did not even know how to prepare a pen properly to be able to write, Padre Flores adds insult to injury by comparing the alleged defects in Maria do Céu's printed works to ugly moles on a Portuguese woman's face. This prejudice actually still exists among Spanish men. Every Spanish man I ask about, and I know I'm taking a side trip here, but what are the stereotypes about Portuguese women? They say they're ugly. Okay. The author wrote most of the poetry. This is Padre Flores speaking. The author wrote most of the poetry that appears in these volumes in Spanish, to which language she has a particular and laudable inclination, but with only the instruction possible to someone who does not own it as a native. And so guiltlessly, it must have some moles, which, if they are not ugly at the court of Lisbon, here in this one, they contradict what is in style. and so it has been necessary for me to reduce them. The translator goes on to explain why he added footnotes to the text and then asserts, "For all of these reasons, you should value this, my copy, more than the defective printing that has served as my original." Padre Flores did not have the benefit of Friedrich Schleiermacher's 1813 insight about the two directions translation can take, moving the reader toward the writer or writer toward the reader. All translations have to make choices. Padre Flores decided to move the Portuguese woman writer toward the Spanish reader. He began with Sor Maria's title, shifting from Engaños del Bosque, Desengaños del Río to La Peregrina, Engaños del Bosque y Desengaños del Río. Next, he abbreviated the chapter heading, leaving out explanations about what the pilgrimess, the roads, the shepherdesses, the garden, the huntresses, and the grove represent. Then he took on the opening sentence of the allegory, switching verb tenses and correcting hyperbatons. Eran da manhã as auroras despedidas do dia, crescidas as luzes became. Ya se había despedido la aurora de las luces del día, estaban ya estas adelantadas, and so on through the 14 chapters. In the final chapter, the pilgrimess, having at last arrived in the garden of the shepherd, glosses a verse from the Song of Songs in a poem that has become the most frequently cited passage of Engaños del Bosque. Maria Duceo wrote the gloss in Spanish. Cobridme de flores que muero de amores, porque de mi aliento el aire no lleve el olor sublime, cobridme. Sea porque todo es uno, alientos de amor y olores de flores de azucenas y jazmines, aquí la mortaja espero, que muero. Si me preguntáis de qué, respondo, en dulces rigores de amores. Both the allusion to the Song of Songs and the images in Cobridme de Flores tie the Peregrina's experience to the mystical union. The soul recites a love poem about a relationship with God. Given that Mother Maria composed the poem in Spanish, Padre Flores had no need to translate, but he made emendations anyway, adding italics and capitalization, changing some spelling, and inserting a lot of punctuation. Perhaps the most significant edit in Flores' version is the migration of the final comma, respondo en dulces rigores de amores. This move changes the meaning of the poem. In Sor Maria's version, the Peregrina dies from love's sweet rigors, but for Padre Flores' pilgrimess, responding to a question becomes a difficult task. In The Translator's Invisibility, Lawrence Venuti recognizes translation as a political practice. In Venuti's view, Schleiermacher's moving the reader toward the writer becomes a foreignizing practice, a form of resistance against ethnocentrism. And moving the writer toward the reader can be a domesticating practice, an ethnocentric reduction of the text. As benevolent as Padre Flores may have felt, his translation nevertheless leaves his Spanish readers, in Schleiermacher's terms, at peace, and brings Maria Duceo and her text to them, domesticating, correcting, and Hispanicizing the work of the Portuguese nun. 77 years later, the German Romantic Hispanist Juan Nicolás Bolde-Faber took up Padre Flores' domesticating practice regarding Maria Duceo's allegory. Born in Hamburg, Bolde-Faber relocated to Cádiz in southwestern Spain when he was 15 years old to help with the family business. Although distant from the capital, he had an impact in the Spanish literary scene. Today, best known as the father of Cecilia Bolde-Faber, who under her pen name Fernán Caballero composed what some critics consider the first Spanish realist novel, Juan Nicolás himself wrote books and newspaper articles which promoted a kind of traditional and Catholic romanticism that sought to recuperate the works of early modern Spanish playwrights and a sense of Spanish nationalism. In 1821, he also ordered or arranged a collection of 371 poems called Floresta de Rimas Antiguas Castellanas, a forest of Castilian verses from yesteryear. published in Hamburg. Boldefalber's organizing efforts involved selecting poems from various published sources, extracting them from their original context, numbering them, and dividing them into 4 broad categories: sacred, doctrinal, amorous, and witty poems. He pulled 2 poems from Enganos do Bosque to include in his section of Rimas Sacras, and without explanation, he numbered them 37 and 58. The practice of excerpting passages from a longer work entails a certain violence. As a result, the 2 Enganos poems lost their context: the story of the peregrina and her struggles to find the shepherd. As he numbered the poems in his anthology, Boldefalber also stripped them of their authors. The reader has to consult the index of writers and sources at the end of the book to discover the poem's origins. In the index, Boldefalber indicates his source for the 2 poems in question as Padre Flores' 1744 book, not Mother Maria's 1741 book. And Boldefalber also reveals that he likely did not understand Portuguese when he gives Maria the unusual surname Doceo, in place of her religious name, Duceu, which refers to the Virgin Mary as the Queen of Heaven. Boldefalber moves poem number 58 toward the romantic sensitivities of his early 19th century readers by adding 3 emphatic exclamation marks. Then, perhaps as a result of sloppy editing, he changes the word me to su, so that in his version, the air, instead of the peregrina, has breath. In part 2 of Enganos, the peregrina must travel the difficult road to the shepherd's garden. Along the way, she meets 3 male and 3 female saints dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses, and they give her advice for her journey. She also encounters an angry mob whose members shout insults and threaten to stone her. Frightened, she hurries away and sings the words that become Boldefalber's poem number 37. Soror Maria wrote the poem in Portuguese. When Padre Flores translated the poem into Spanish, he altered several words in the poem, presumably to support rhyme and meter, but affecting meaning in at least 2 significant places. Where the Portuguese talks about falling frost or thorns at hand, the Spanish refers to falling stones and a pathway of derision. Boldefalber made even more drastic changes to wording in the poem. For example, maybe in an effort to help the poem make sense on its own, he replaced the hidden garden and the noiseless stream that the pilgrimess was seeking in the final lines of the poem with a lost port and an unknown subject wounded by everyone. In his introduction, Boldefalber claims that in his opinion, none of the selected poems lacks merit. Whoever understands Spanish and has a poetic sense will find in the sacred verses whatever can exalt the soul and enliven devotion. The editor apparently did not trust the reader to feel exalted and enlivened by Soror Maria's poems without his help. John Bowring read Floresta de Rimas Antiguas Castellanas within 3 years of its publication and trusted Boldefalber as editor. Long before he became the 4th governor of Hong Kong, Bowring, an English political economist, hymn writer, and polyglot, published numerous volumes of poetry that he translated from diverse languages. In the 1820s and 30s, he produced collections of his English versions of poems from the Russian, Batavian, Polish, Serbian, Magyar, and Czech languages. His Ancient Poetry and Romances of Spain, which appeared in 1824, owes a great deal to Boldefalber's Floresta de Rimas Antiguas, including its title. After all, poems originally composed in the mid-18th century had not existed long enough to become ancient. Bowring translated the same 2 Maria Duceo poems that Boldefalber used in his collection. Following the editor's lead, Bowring refers to the poet as Maria Duceo and cites her obras printed in Madrid, but introduces a new mistake, giving 1774 rather than 1744 as the year of publication. By definition, in its concern for the target audience, a creative translation by Bowring would, in Venuti's terms, domesticate the text. A free translation, which seeks to render the meaning of a text in another language without following the original accurately, would likewise domesticate the text. Bowring's versions go beyond creative or free translation and might more accurately be called creative or free mistranslations. They do not follow the source text accurately, nor do they render the meaning of the text, but instead create new and misgendered meanings. Bowring's troubles with Cobrime de Flores may begin with the effort to find words to rhyme with flowers. And you can see my effort in the program if you look at my translations in there. It's hard, okay? When he settles on showers and bowers, he has to make the meaning of the poem fit with those words. Cobrime de Flores becomes fling your sweet flowers, and then instead of covering the poem's speaker, the flowers are scattered beneath. Beneath rhymes well with an odoriferous wreath, however unpoetic that might sound, which, however, appears nowhere in the source text. Pinks appear in Bowring's bouquet to take up a syllable, and Maria Duceo's shroud disappears from his version. In all, half of the words in Bowring's translation do not correspond to the source text. Stripped of its context, Cover Me With Flowers becomes a secular love poem and loses its deeper religious meaning. In contrast, Bowring's version of the song sung by the frightened peregrina, threatened by a mob, could be read as more foreignizing. In other words, in this translation, Bowring might leave Maria Duceo more at peace and ask his readers to move toward her poem. He renders meanings fairly accurately in his translation of Bole Faber's translation, only shifting the singular piedra to the plural stones, the narrow estrecho road to a perplexed road, and the lost Puerto Perdido to the path mistaken. In comparison with his rendition of Cobrime de Flores, these few shifts might appear minor, except for the new title Bowring gives the poem, The Crucifixion, and as a result, the new identity and gender he bestows on its protagonist. Bowring erases the female peregrina, enduring hardships on her quest to find a shepherd from the poem, and replaces her with the shepherd himself. After Bole Faber took Maria Duceo's two poems out of context, Bowring took over to creatively misread them through a masculine lens. I'll show you the same way. By 1832, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, this is not her, had read and taken notes on Bowring's book. In her article in Victorian Poetry, actress and line editor of the Sonnets from the Portuguese in Volume 2 of the 2010 Pickering and Shadow edition of works of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Barbara Neri explains, on page 3 recto of her diary, Barrett begins a 7-page list of Spanish and Portuguese poets. Exploring the 58 poets she lists is an exhaustive education in the history of Spanish and Portuguese literature. I don't agree. It includes representatives of the medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods and many genres thereof. EBB made her list from John Bowring's 1824 Ancient Poetry and Romances of Spain, recording the name of every poet and all the titles of their poems in the order they are listed in Bowring's book. Neri focuses on two poems in her article, two poets, in her article, Camões and Maria Duceo. She argues convincingly that images from Cobrime de Flores, at least as filtered through Bowring, found their way into at least two of Barrett's sonnets from the Portuguese. Maria Duceo's lilies that rain down in Bowring's rendering may appear in sonnet 24, very whitely still, the lilies of our lives may reassure, their blossoms from their roots, accessible alone to heavenly dews that drop not fewer. The opening quatrain of Sonnet 23 may recall Maria Duceo's dying pilgrimess awaiting her shroud, and perhaps Bowring's odoriferous wreath scattered beneath. Barrett begins, Is it indeed so, if I lay here dead, wouldst thou miss any life in losing mine? And would the sun for thee more coldly shine because of grave damps falling round my head? Neri has told me in a series of email exchanges that she believes Barrett could have read the Portuguese poets in their own language. If so, this may come out in the line, then love me, love, look on me, breathe on me. In this intimate verse, Barrett gives to the speaker's lover the breath that Bolde-Faber had taken from her and given to the air. Like Bowring, the German poets Immanuel Geibel and Paul Hesse read Bolde-Faber's Floresta de Rimas Antiguas, and their collaboration led to the 1852 publication of German translations of Spanish and French poems in a collection titled Spanisches Liederbuch, not to mention the French at all. The book's index indicates Geibel as the translator of the anonymous Spanish poem Cubrirme de Flores. Far removed from Maria Buceo's Enganos do Bosque, the collaborators included Geibel's translation in their section of worldly or secular weibliche Lieder, worldly or secular songs. There you go. His version closely approximates the meanings in Bolde-Faber, except that rather than awaiting her shroud, the speaker asked to have her grave prepared with flowers. The translator made no effort at rhyme, but he did care about meter. The lyrical quality of his translation has led multiple composers. I've got to turn it down. Okay, so the lyrical quality of his translation has led multiple composers to set Bedeckt mich mit Blumen to music. In 1847, before Geibel and Heiss's book came out, Adolf Bernhard Marx, a German music theorist and critic, published his opus 22, Spanische Lieder, for one voice and piano, including Geibel's translation as the second of 12 songs. The great German Romantic composer Robert Schumann wrote the version we are listening to, though we can barely hear now, in 1849 and published it in 1857. He wrote his opus 138, Spanische Liebeslieder, movement number 4, as a piano duet for 2 voices. We hear American soprano Barbara Bonney and Austrian mezzo-soprano Angelika Kirchlager. Schumann imagines 2 women dying of love and perhaps sharing their pain. His version eliminates the 3rd stanza of the gloss, so love's breath does not intermingle with the flower's fragrances. After Schumann, musical settings for Bedeckt mich mit Blumen followed by the Russian pianist and conductor Anton Rubinstein in 1867, by the German-American Leopold Damrosch in 1870, by Friedrich August Naubert in 1876, by the Austrian lawyer Heinrich Molbe in 1879, by the German conductor and music teacher Ferdinand von Hiller in 1881, by Severin Barterasiewicz, I'm not going to try again, in 1882, by the German organist and choir director Felix Gorsch in 1887, by the Austrian pianist and music teacher Anton Bruckhoff in 1899, and famously by the Austrian music critic Hugo Wolf in 1891. None of these composers knew that a Portuguese nun had penned the lyrics they set to music, nor that the speaker of the poem represented the soul expressing her love to God. The composer's songs have grown so popular that translators have produced multiple versions of Immanuel Geibel's German songs in other languages. After an injury to her right hand, the English pianist Constance Bache took up translation, and in 1880 she published 59 songs of Rubinstein with German and English words. One of the songs is her translation, Or Strew Me with Flowers. Bache closely renders the meaning of her German source text, straying only at the end when the poetic voice insists that the love she dies from is unrequited. Bach makes her version singable, but makes no effort to maintain the poetic form of the gloss. Maria Luceo, and even Maria Docio, has disappeared as author of the text. The same thing occurs, Maria Luceo has been erased, in the 1903 translation of the collected songs of Leopold Damrosch. Mary L. Webster's version of the poem, With Flowers Enshroud Me, brings the grave clothes back into the poem, but following Damrosch's musical lead, Webster abandons the theme and begins her poem immediately with the gloss. Gender roles have reversed in these renditions. The poet is now male, and translation has become feminine territory. The website, leader.net, lists various translations of Bedeckt mich mit Blumen, including a 2008 French, a 2009 Italian, and a 2012 Dutch version. But most remarkably, leader.net provides a 2005 Spanish translation by Abel Alamillo Fernandez of the poem that the Portuguese nun originally penned in Spanish. I'm going to skip a paragraph. Let me just do this. The Peregrina's pilgrimage took her through the Hunter's Grove, along the road of Hesperides, and across the lake of tribulation to the garden of the shepherd. But she also traveled to Madrid, Hamburg, London, Berlin, to concert halls in many parts of the world and into several languages. Literary texts migrate, and the journey sometimes enriches, other times impoverishes, and too often erases the traveler. The travels of Madre Maria Luceo's Enganos do Bosque, Desenganos do Rio, along the road of translation, mistranslation, and misreading, matter because of the relationships, intertextualities, and influences they create. As an author, Maria Luceo should matter to us not only for those connections, and not alone for the large body of her work published and celebrated during her lifetime. Against the odds, high levels of illiteracy in the early modern period, lack of widespread education for girls, the imposition of rules of obedience on nuns that led many of them to burn their manuscripts, natural disasters including the 1755 earthquake, xenophobia and political prejudices which continue to lead Northern Europe to view its southern neighbors as inferior, and literary historical forgetfulness. Maria Luceo's books and manuscripts have survived. For all those reasons, her works deserve our deep respect and best efforts as archivists, editors, translators, and readers. I did cut out a paragraph because I was hoping maybe somebody would want to ask a question. I should have cut out the paragraph. Yes.
Sorry, so
Don't make it hard, Will. I told you I don't want any technical translation questions.
I didn't have the benefit of part of the program that has your translation in there.
Oh.
So I just wanted to ask, it might be obvious from your treatment of other translations, but what were you trying to preserve or convey most in your translation?
So I did want to do a foreignizing translation. I want the translation to speak to the audience, but I really want to bring the audience to Maria Luceo. And so it was important to me to, translating poetry for me is like doing a puzzle. And so I want to preserve meter, and I want to preserve rhyme, and I also want to preserve meaning. And so I kind of figure out how to, I don't know if this is helping you, but I do a rough translation for meaning, so that I feel like I'm close to the meaning, and then I start thinking about how I can make the words rhyme the way that they should. And sometimes Maria Lucero will also do acrostics, so I have to worry about first letters and things like that. And which is fun. I mean, it makes it more fun, right? When there's like an interesting form. And it's like kind of like a crossword puzzle or Sudoku for me. It really is mathematical in some way. And then I will work on meter so that I feel like I'm getting it right. Because I want all of that to, I want everybody to, who can't read the source text to be able to value all of that effort that Maria Lucero was putting into it. Yes?
Where does your work go now? Is it going to spread throughout the world?
Well, this is probably the largest audience that my work will ever have. but I will modify this piece and send it to a journal, and hope people will be interested in reading it. And I have translated the 14 chapter allegory, and then my friend Christina Cowley did an edition of it, so we have sent it off, and it's under consideration by a press to publish it in Portuguese. Well, the original is written in Portuguese and Spanish, and then mine is in English, obviously, and so people can read it in all three languages if they want. Yes, yeah.
So the sort of broader message I'm taking away is that this kind of mistranslation, misappropriation, all those
adjectives.
Yeah, it's happening more because she's a woman, right? So this is like mansplaining. It's manslating.
Well, that's definitely the case with Padre Flores. I mean, there's like no question that he felt like he was going to improve the text by working on it.
She's a woman. Like, we don't know, but
no, I mean, he definitely knows she's a woman, and he definitely knows that he thinks it's inferior because she's a woman and she's Portuguese.
So it makes you wonder how many other times has that happened? Is this a pattern?
Yeah.
Probably, right? Where women.
Yeah, all of those things that I was trying to list in my conclusion actually, I mean, happened to other women writers, right? I mean, we've lost all kinds of manuscripts because of natural disasters, but also because many of the really great women writers from Iberia in the early modern period wrote their stuff, and then they burned it because that's what their confessor told them to do. And so, I mean, that was their show of obedience. Maria de Jesus de Ágreda rewrote it after she burned it, so 7 volumes of her life story of the Virgin. But others we just lost. Lope de Vega's daughter, I actually should say, I should refer to it. Let's see, how could I do it? I can't do it. We should refer to Lope as Marcela de San Felix's dad, right? But anyway, Lope de Vega's daughter, Marcela de San Felix, had 5 volumes of poetry and plays, and she burned 4 of them. So we have 1. So we know how great they are in that 1 volume, but we lost the other 4. So, yeah, I mean, in the early modern period, there's, I mean, just against all odds, really, that we had to have the text. And then, I mean, the earthquake was, I mean, we lost a lot of things in the fires and stuff. Obviously, text by men as well. So if it hadn't found, if it was hard to get published, then it would be hard to survive the earthquake. Yes?
How easy is it to recover kind of the original text, right? So already, I mean, there's no manuscripts, you know, from what she wrote. You don't have anything in her hand, I presume.
So we do have some manuscripts, but not of this published work. This, I mean, all we have is the published, and so that's what we're going on by, right?
I mean, is there any hints that even that first published work has kind of altered? I mean, even so far that she doesn't seem to be overseeing the publication of her own work.
What's really tough about it is that between 1736 and 1741, there are emendations in the 10 chapters that we had. And so, I mean, we have those 2 versions, right? So, and there are a lot of changes, and we actually made the decision to go with 1736 as our source text of the first 10 chapters, because I think that the emendations introduce errors into the text. And so, I mean, because she's living in a convent for over 70 years, right? From the time she's 16 years old till 95, she doesn't leave the convent. And because she's got people making copies of her work, and because she's passing it to people on the outside, and then the printers are making decisions about what they're going to introduce.
it's not easy to get back to that intentionality. But right now, Christina and I are working on the very oldest manuscript that we have of hers. It's a short allegory that she wrote in 1681 after the death of a friend, and it's a little story about flowers dying young. And each of the flower, there's like 5 short chapters, and there's a flower in each chapter, and then this flower has a sort of swan song and little poems at the end, and it's a meditation on dying young because her friend was bled to death in the convent. Yes.
So, given your work with convent literature, where do you see the future of these studies? How do you see people? Are people interested in understanding the connection between what was produced in convents and how it impacted not only the society at the time, but the kind of future generations?
Yeah, I think we think of convents and Spain and Portugal as very exotic and very other. And just Spain and Portugal generally, right? Spanish women, Portuguese women, they are different. They are, some of them we don't understand. And then if you say you're going to talk about nuns, from our point of view, it seems very other. But in the 17th and 18th century, convents were not other at all. They were central. They were located downtown. They are still located downtown in major cities, right? But maybe they are not inhabited to the same degree that they were in this period. But they were part of daily life for everybody there. So relations, Maria Luceo's convent was a royal convent. The daughters of nobility lived in the convent, and the king, sometimes the queen would take a vacation and spend her vacation in that convent. And so kings and queens came to that convent to get advice from the Mother Superior. She had all kinds of relationships with noble women who were sort of her patrons and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of relations between the intramuros and extramuros, right, in the time period. So I think that there is a growing body of scholars here in the United States, but also in Spain and Portugal, who are thinking about convent literature, and so I think it's growing. I think it's a growing field. I don't know if that answers your question, but I definitely think it's the case that there's more and more interest and more recognition for it.
Did she see her published, some of her published?
She did, yeah.
So
She had, there were 9 books published during her lifetime.
So she was able to say, I didn't mean it that way.
Well, yeah, I'm not positive that's true. She sort of had to send it out and she could see it, but I don't think she got to make changes, yeah. Matt, did you have a question? Oh, okay, yes.
So how widely known is Maria Luceo's work in Portuguese-speaking, sort of non-scholars?
Yeah, so let me just say that's a really interesting question because she was so prolific during her lifetime. There was another 95-year-old nun who lived at the same time, Valerie Hegstrom, and she's much more well-known. Maria Luceo has practically been lost. People in Portugal, when I go and tell them I'm working with Portuguese nuns, they say, oh, Mariana de Alcoforado, and that's another long story. But she probably didn't write the things that they know. It was probably written by a French man who was claiming that she wrote these love letters that were published in France at the time. So yeah, Portuguese people generally learn a lot from me when they talk to me. Thanks so much for coming.